Bro, it's June.
What?
We started this podcast in January.
We did it.
We've been at it for 6 months, bro. High fives. Virtual high fives. I'm a filmmaker.
I'm a scientist.
And we're two friends who've made movies together.
And launched a company together.
And we lost our money.
And our identity.
But we are finding ourselves again.
And this is our podcast.
This is it.
Welcome.
In this episode, we dive into a discussion on movie villains.
And whether they're improved by explanatory backstories.
And how our view of story villains impacts our view of real-world villains.
And vice versa.
It's a fun conversation that goes deep and it goes wide.
But first, I recall the time that Thomas taught me how to whisper.
And I give a quick update on the John Woo project that I mentioned a few episodes back.
And speaking of good, great movie villains.
Face Off, baby. One of the best to subvert the movie villain convention.
Plus, just doves everywhere. All that and more on episode 12. What was it? What's the first time we ever flew together? Like, literally.
Ever?
Yeah, like we sat on a plane. I mean, because, it was late in our friendship. Like, BTP had started. We wouldn't have flown together until I moved to Charlotte, right? So maybe it was Austin. Was that the first time we ever, were on the same flight together?
Early 2016, we flew to Finish Fair.
So it was that. That was the trip. That was the first time we ever flew together.
February 2016.
Okay, so yeah, sure. You and I were on that flight, and I don't remember the content or the topic that you and I were talking about. I don't know if it was like taboo or what it was. But we were talking, and you were whispering to me, and I was responding to you, but loudly, and you said to me, dude, can you whisper? And I was like, I am whispering. You're like, that's not whispering. And I was like, what? You're like, you don't know how to whisper? And then I was like, oh wait, this is, oh God, this is whispering. Because the whole time I would just talk lower, like, okay, I'm talking less loud. And I was like, how old was I? That's 25. So I was like 32, 33. And I had never whispered in my entire life.
I taught you how to whisper.
I know, it was pretty cool. You don't remember that really? That was
I do.
That was such a pivotal moment in my life, is that Thomas Torrey taught me that I didn't know what whispering was. And it was revelatory, because I seriously had never tried to change my voice in that way. I didn't realize I could go down lower, not in register, but in
Right, when you remove your chest and it's just throat.
So anyway.
I remember that, actually. And I remember because it's like there was a kid. Yeah, most people are taught it as children. So if you've taught your kids, and basically I've taught your kids how to whisper.
I think I don't think I have taught my kids. I think it was I just didn't talk very much as a kid at all. And so nobody ever had to teach me, because I didn't have to be taught to whisper, because I was just like, I'll just not talk. And that was that was my thing as a kid. My parents thought I had a hearing disorder. Actually, I had to go get tested.
When did you think of that to remind you? Was it like last time we were talking?
I think I was whispering something, and then I was like, I just remembered how I learned how to whisper.
I got a quick update from one of your two picks. Watched Mitchell's vs. the Machines with the family.
Oh, yeah?
That is a great movie.
Yeah.
It's definitely got a little dusty in the room. When the dad, that scene where he's saying goodbye to his dream, which is this mountain cabin. Yeah. And you realize he gave up the dream for his daughter. And I was just like, keep it together. Because, that's weighing on my mind often these days.
It's hard because you got to set something aside. We talked with Eve about this, and I think I said it, you got to set things aside for yourself, but there's no way around it. I mean, we make sacrifices for our kids.
Right. That's life. Well, that's having a family, at least, is just, making sacrifices for the greater nucleus, whatever it is, in your own sort of respective unit. And it's a great movie. And I actually, the opening credits, when I saw Lord, Chris Miller were the producers on it. They didn't direct it, but they were producers. But they produced Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the Lego Movie, two of the greatest animated films in ever, perhaps.
Transcend animated film as a genre.
Exactly. And so Lord and Miller are the superstars I shit on Pixar, but it's like, it's not because I have any aversion to animated films, because, Lord and Miller are doing it. And Mitchell's vs. Machines is a great example of like, oh, Pixar wishes it made that movie, because it was just a great movie. But I saw their names on it. I was like, oh, okay, this is why I'm already vibing with it. And dude, like when they get those robots and the robots get all malfunctioned, and like I was dying in the couch when they're just like, work with me here, and like because these robots are malfunctioning and becoming very helpful when they're instead of being like killing. And it was just and I think who's Portlandia? He's one of those.
Oh yeah. The two voice actors that did that,
Fred Armisen.
They were hilarious.
So funny. My only criticism was like they had this amazing intro and a great funny bit, but they kind of fell off the focus as the movie went on. I was like, oh, I want those guys to kind of bring back, because they were just great. But yeah, great recommendation, and watched it with the fam. And
well, I will keep the cartoon Rex coming, man. That seems to be my wheelhouse.
Unfortunately, we watched Raya and the Last Dragon last night, which was Disney Plus's big animated film. A lot of people love it. It was a great movie. The animation's pretty incredible, and a great all Asian cast. I just thought it was just a little too basic and boring. I was just like, eh. Unfortunately, I was really primed to like, oh man, another great animated film, and I'm probably the outlier because I think it got really well reviewed, and the kids really loved it. Like even Skylar was like, that was a good movie. So I was like, oh, cool. But for some reason, it didn't have that. It felt like very standard animated adventure period piece, that kind of subgenre of animated films. And Awkwafina plays kind of one of the leads, who's supposed to be very funny. And I like Awkwafina in some things. She really doesn't do it for me in other things, and this particular performance was a little grating. It just felt like a little like, over trying to be like the funny, side character, because that's what you do. Mm-hmm. And I kept wondering, like, I wonder if they really did a completely different tone and sort of voice for this dragon character, and didn't make it try to be funny and hilarious. Wonder what that would have done. But anyway.
So you also had an update on John Woo project. Do you want to talk about that?
Gosh, I guess it's been over a month since we last talked about the John Woo project that I was in the discussion for. And it's now, because it now feels like weeks since I've sort of have an update on that. We haven't had a chance to talk about it. But I am not going to be the screenwriter for this John Woo project. They actually haven't selected the screenwriter. I did have a good conversation with them. There's a world where I could have ended up being runner-up. They're proceeding with another screenwriter, but we were the only two they were talking to. It was that was really surprising for me to learn.
Not that there weren't plenty of options.
Well, sure.
The only two that moved forward were you two. Which is,
exactly, pretty
cool.
Yeah, we were the only two who made it to like the talk to John Woo level, and they were super complimentary. It just came down to like, ultimately the vision that I was sort of pitching wasn't quite what they were wanting, which is the great part of how you find a writer. And they're not even fully sure what they're looking for. It's sort of like, I'll know it when I see it. And, right. I took some big swings in my pitch, and they were super complimentary, very at peace with the process and very grateful for the process. And, have no regrets about what I pitched, how I handled it, or how I pitched, or anything. I did a pretty good job of not expecting to get this gig and not banking on it. You put some hope on it, but I realized sort of when I didn't get it, it did sort of throw me into a different mindset of like, all right, I got to really find some income for this summer. And so it just, in a good way, I think it's pushed me to really throw my net out to a lot further than I have in the past for just finding work to get through the summer, because I still have this big pitch in July for All the Names We Buried, and planning to shoot that in September if we can raise the money. But
Well, I said this to you a couple of weeks ago, and I said it to you. I was serious. I don't know if it sounded like I was being flippant, but that I was, trying this new thing where, like, in some spare time, I was like fucking around with stocks and options and kind of like learning, beyond just like I'm going to buy the stock and wait for it to go up. Like, I believe in Apple, but like starting to do derivative trading, which is like insanely more profitable. And this is what I'm learning. And I think, do you remember this conversation? And I told you that I had taken $4,000 of gambling money, and I put it in an account, and I was going to set aside 10% for you, and for the film,
right?
And I was like, I'm going to grow it as much as I can but until filming time, and I will give you. So at that time, $400. That's what I was willing to give T-Bag. So just quick update. I got that account right now. I'm looking at it, $55,000.
How much?
$55,000.
The total account
that I started with 4,000.
Yeah, it's up to 55,000.
Mm-hmm.
So the 10% is up to 5,500.
Yep,
that's incredible.
And that was a month ago.
What?
Yep.
You just turned $4,000 into $55,000 in a month?
Yep.
Just because you're just doing aggressive trading with now a deeper degree of knowledge of what you're doing?
Well, and again, it's derivative trading. So like you make exponential amounts of money. So like for example, if I make a bet that Apple's going to go up by $2, if I bought 100 shares at $100, that would cost me $10,000, and I would make 200, right? Because it went up $2 a share on my 100 shares. If I bought options, I could buy way more options for that $10,000. I mean, I could probably buy 10 contracts, which is equal to 1,000 shares. So I would make $2,000 and even more depending on how risky the bet is. And so this is essentially what I've learned. And
dude, that's awesome.
So I know it may be unreasonable to hope for that same consistent like growth,
exponential growth.
But like, if I could do, how many months away is September? 3?
Oh gosh, July. Yes. Oh my gosh, this is crazy.
Man, if I could keep it up and do 10x per month, that'd be $500,000 next month, and it'd be $5 million the month after that. I got $500,000. There we go.
Boom. Well, I
mean, if I turned that into $5 million, I would legit give you $500,000.
That's incredible. Well, thank you.
Get yourself into it. Thought you might have had a chance and blew it. I shouldn't have to be the one that tells you this.
Coming up, our discussion on movie villains.
Inspired by the online debate over Disney's new film, Cruella.
Which neither of us have seen.
Classic two friends, am I right? Huh?
Stay with us.
All right? You all right? You all right?
You know I never want to judge you, brother. I tend to like my mind in the gutter, too. To hold you, old transgressors coming out. Make peace with all your demons when you just don't have the strength to cast them out. I got a problem and I can't seem to fix it. Might as touch for turning things to shit. I'm trying to learn to keep my curses to myself.
So I wanted to talk about this topic that was brought to my attention by Rebecca. She was telling me, I'm not on social media, so I haven't seen this sort of discussion playing out, but there have been mixed reactions to Cruella, the new Disney film that is the prequel to 101 Dalmatians, sort of centering on the backstory of Cruella de Vil. I believe I haven't seen it, so we're not really going to get into the specifics, more just sort of a specific idea that within the film. But I believe it starts with her as a young child and then sort of jumps forward into her 20s, and that is where the bulk of the film takes place, and sort of like her formative, like how she became this iconic villain. That if you're of a certain age range, like you saw the film and you know it. And the discussion that's being had online is the idea of whether or not we should continue to give our villains compelling or relatable backstories. And I believe the tweet that Rebecca paraphrased was, I think that we need to stop giving villains traumatic and humanizing backstories. Sometimes people are just evil. And that was the idea. And so that's kind of what I want to explore with you is there room for that backstory, or should we just allow them to be who they are? What do you think?
Well, it strikes me, I have not seen Cruella either. The reviews have been pretty mixed. And I feel like in the case of movies, the only rule in your storytelling should be make a good movie. So if the movie is humanizing a villain or exploring a backstory for a villain, if it makes a good movie, it's a good movie. If it doesn't, then you can point to reasons. It's like, why are people not responding to it? My mind immediately goes to larger extrapolations on life itself and how we view villains within life and how we view them in film. Now, it's interesting because in my head, I feel like, yeah, any good film should be able to have a good villain, and they should be, as long as they're sort of understandable, we know why they're doing what they're doing. We don't have to like it or defend it, or there doesn't even have to be a reason, a traumatic reason for it. As long as we understand the villain, great villains can be the best kind of, villains in film. Inglourious Bastards had a great villain in Hans Landa. But so I instinctively believe that about film, that should be able to have really good, delicious, evil villains. But then I'm thinking about all my own stories and I'm thinking about Fair. Well, there's not a villain there. It's a much more nuanced, sort of this love triangle where they're all sort of antagonists and they're all in each other's stories. And, it's not a traditional villain there. I'm thinking of all the names we buried. There's definitely not a traditional villain there. It's sort of a two-handed protagonist story. Then you realize, well, one of those protagonists is the antagonist, but he's a very relatable character, and you ultimately feel sympathy for him, even though he's the agent of antagonism in this story. And even other stories, like Premise, we wrote a whole script about the villain being the man himself, your own internal monster that you're trying to keep at bay. And it's like, I'm thinking about all the other stories that are in my head that I want to write. None of them have this sort of traditional villain. And I wonder if that is because of how I view the world, where my bent as a person is to always extend charity to everyone. And I actually, I've talked about this a lot recently with some friends, resisting the binary nature of our world and culture, and really promoting myself as like a third, like a non-dualistic thinker. Like that's what I want to be. That's what I try to be. I am neither a Republican or a Democrat. So politically, I am equal parts frustrated with both parties, and most of my friends fall on one or the other. So, we're always having these conversations, and I tend to think this dualistic nature of our culture is actually hurting it. And then I read articles and in the media, every news story, someone is villainized and someone is victimized. And I don't believe life is that binary. I believe it's much more nuanced. So it's really frustrating when a character is portrayed as the villain in a real life news story and another character is portrayed as the victim. In many stories, it can be that binary. Someone did an evil thing to an innocent. That happens. But in so many other stories, I do believe it is much more nuanced than that. And there was a great quote I heard from a filmmaker. It was actually Russell Brand quoting a filmmaker, where it said, "The removal of nuance is tyranny." And I think about that in the context of a media narrative where we strip nuance from something intentionally. If we forget nuance, it's just ignorance. But if we remove nuance, there's something much more destructive there. Now, do we need to apply that to a fiction story? The short answer is no, and I don't really know why. I think it can be more binary in a story, although I think great stories are nuanced as well. And that doesn't mean every villain needs sort of a relatable backstory.
So
but
I think
if they're within the larger context of this idea of the redeemability of every person, then maybe that's where we are as a culture. Is the fact that we are in a very divisive point in our culture bleeding over into the stories we tell and the frustration with how our villains are portrayed?
Yeah, just an observation kind of on what you were just saying. I feel like what you were talking about, sometimes, there are like people that are just straight victims and victimizers, right? And that sort of binary exists. And I feel like it sort of was imagining as you were saying that was like, yeah, that's true. And it's true when you zoom in enough, right? And it's almost like you can have those with vignettes. And if a story is a vignette, then you can have an allegorical, like to the point of allegory, sort of good and evil, right? But if you zoom out, then this story becomes larger and it becomes more nuanced. And I think that there are things in sort of in our lives where sometimes we just want a story of good triumphing over evil. Like we just want that, like life is so confusing and complicated and it's so hard to know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. We just want to know. And we want to, and then to that end, we want to see good triumph. So I get that the desire. And I could see sort of, in like you were saying, the context of our current society, people rebelling against this sort of humanization of classical villains because we don't want to see it in our current real life like villains. We don't want to, because we've gotten so polarized, we don't want to give them the opportunity to be redeemed. And that was kind of my initial response when when Rebecca was telling me about this. It's like, this has got to be something for a deeper cultural narrative going on. But I feel that way in like a Marvel movie where you're like, you see the good triumph and you're like, yeah, and it like gives you that rush. But
talking about Marvel, Thanos is a great villain because he has a logic for wanting to destroy half the population of the universe. And you don't buy into it, but you understand it. And because he's so committed to this conviction, he becomes this great villain. Like nobody is calling him anything other than a villain, but he is definitely the hero of his own story. And that's an obvious, that's a kind of a classic quote, that we're all the heroes of our own story. And the films that at least touch on that to a degree in the villains make a fuller picture. It's interesting what you talked about of maybe we are resisting the need to humanize our villains in films because then that forces us to humanize the villains in our life.
Or at least give them the opportunity to consider the humanization of them.
And I would ask you, because if someone like Donald Trump is an obvious villain in our American story of the last few years, now there is a significant, half this population actually, well, I don't know if half the population sees him as a hero, but a significant amount of the population of our country, our American brothers and sisters, see him as a hero. A significant amount see him as a true villain. I do not like him. I really like how you talked about the degree which you zoom in determines the level of nuance in the villains, because there are some instances where he has been villainous. The classic Hollywood Access tape. I ask everybody, it's just like, how can you listen to that where he's talking about grabbing women by the pussies and, forcing himself on them, and if you're a star, they let you. How can you listen to that and not see a villain, not hear a villain in that? And I have called him inhuman at times. Now, I have largely felt wrong about calling him inhuman because I am by nature a peacemaker that wants to extend charity to everyone. And even if he is worse than I think he might be, or worse than someone is, he is still a human being who is the way he is because of events, choices that he's made, yes, but those choices were preceded by, he was born as a baby, and it would be anti-science to say he was born evil because it's anti-psychology. We all know that there are psychological things that make us the way we are. And that is not to excuse someone's behavior, because there is evil behavior. There is wrong behavior, both illegal, but also to a deeper moral level, wrong. But it also then forces me, and I do believe this, that every human is within the realm of redemption. That no one is beyond hope. And I want to believe that because I am aware of my own potential for evil. And I would hate to cross too far where I cannot be forgiven, redeemed. And it's interesting. I wonder if there's something in Cruella because she's an animal abuser. Like this particular villain, it's like if you abuse animals or collect them, she's obviously, maybe she does beat them in the original cartoon. There's something about abuse to animals that really incites the hatred of people upon that villain and is almost irredeemable. And I think of a friend of mine who's a single woman who is just a devoted animal lover and advocate, and even has said, I love animals more than humans. I know she's not alone. And I remember her talking about Michael Vick, a man convicted of dog fighting and the abuse that comes with that. And she declared him unforgivable. He would forever, in her eyes, be irredeemable. He was a villain. He crossed over because, he did this horrible thing. Now, forget the fact that Michael Vick denounced what he did, said it was wrong, and then went to jail and actually paid for his crimes, those that he broke the law, and has now largely been accepted back into, the NFL community. He's a commentator because he's made good on the internal change that he projected. So there's actual progress. And, but that's not good enough for her. He will always be a villain. And I just don't believe that. I believe that everyone, not everyone will, plenty of villains will remain villains, but they all can. And I guess my own heart of charity needs to extend that to them. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts about that in terms of someone like Trump and this thing you said of, are we forced to contend with the villains of our own culture if we extend that sort of humanity to the villains on our screens?
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I do want to answer that, but before we move on, it just reminds me of a writing session that we had for Premise with Eric. We were working on something, and Eric was saying that we need to raise the stakes with sort of Ethan's psychotic, like the danger, right? And he was like, I think that we should give Ethan a dog, or like a neighbor's dog, and Ethan should kill the dog. And I was like, nope, absolutely not. And he was like, why not? I was like, you cannot kill a dog. I was like, name one story where you have somebody who kills a dog and is ever forgiven. Right?
Yeah.
I was like, you see that character kill a dog? He's like, oh, we don't have to show it. I was like, it doesn't matter. And I'm a dog lover. I've had dogs my whole life. I love dogs. I'm not, I don't know if I put myself in the same class as your friend, where it's like, I love dogs more than people. Sometimes, I mean, there's some people,
certain people,
some dogs I love more than certain people. But I agree with that sentiment, and maybe it's because of the vulnerability of the animal. Anyway, that was funny that you brought that up, because I very vividly remember that writing session.
I do remember that, and the compromise was when he kills the lab rat, which I still think was too much. There were
people who were really put off by that.
And if it was our vote, we would have outvoted him. It wasn't a vote. I mean, he felt strongly, and it was sort of, I remember, I guess, conceding. I do feel like he ended up filming and editing the rat death a lot more graphically than we had sort of talked about. But
yeah, he did. So, but to your question about Trump in the terms of like the redeemability, like I recognize that I have a strong bias against Trump. I think a lot of my distaste for him is based in reality. I have tried to be grounded in it. I think there are very many reasons to dislike Trump, but I will concede that I struggle to find redeeming qualities, redeeming choices in him. And the thought of the question to me was, think of a circumstance in which Trump would be redeemed, in which you feel like Trump would break even in the scales in your mind. It is very, very hard for me to imagine that. And maybe part of it is it's like, I can't imagine him doing these things. I'm like, maybe if he were to, apologize for the racism and all that stuff, and he were to work hard, like in the way that you were talking about Michael Vick, I don't know, has Michael Vick like donated to charities for animals and like done that kind of stuff, in addition to the paying for the crime in the way that our society, seems to think is fit, which is just going to prison. Has he shown a reformation in his behavior, not just by abstaining from the distasteful behavior, but by going out of his way to pay reparations for it? And it's like that in that sense. And could I see Trump doing that? it is honestly hard for me to imagine him doing that. But then it's even hard for me to imagine, because of my personal bias, like what would it take for me to say, okay, I don't have a deep loathing for Trump anymore. But I admit that, that personal bias, and I would love to see that. I was really devastated when he won the election. But there was a moment when I said, okay, maybe there's a chance, because I think, maybe a nuance in difference between our beliefs is, and I don't mean this to be argumentative, just like a sort of a difference is like, I don't believe in evil. I believe in selfishness. And I feel like that is the root of all bad things that happen, right? I feel like anything that you can, and this might be oversimplifying it. I'm sure you could find counterexamples, but like people doing evil things, that we consider evil. It's driven by selfishness to some extent. Even if it's just that like you are hurting people because you like it, you are selfishly feeding that masochistic, or I'm sorry, I guess that would be the sadist, impulse. And whether it's driven by, greed for money, greed for power, like that leads to all of these evil things. And so it's like rejecting that selfishness is where we typically find goodness in, sort of in my view. So it's hard for me to imagine that given the nature of his character.
Well, and it's even interesting with someone like Trump. Now, I believe he actually has developed an actual clinical condition called narcissism. Like he's an actual clinical narcissist.
Pathological narcissism.
Pathologically. So he is now mentally evolved to a state that actually is something that is, I do believe he could be free from it, but it would actually take some clinical work. Like any condition any of us might develop because of trauma. You could do it the same way, like, oh, I have a deep fear, or even something like, multiple personality syndrome, this crazy, phenomenon that happens through deep trauma. It's like to undo that, to get out of that requires a lot of work. And so a lot of villains, if to call them just pure evil, that's sort of reductive, but it's the idea. It's like, well, yeah, they've clearly, obviously had some sort of traumatic path to get there, but it's crossed over into something neurological. And so it would be disingenuous just to be like, oh, I've seen the error of my ways. Forgive me. I'm good within the context of a story, in the same way that someone who has developed something that is truly psychological, it's going to take a lot more than just him seeing the error of his ways. So like your inability to imagine a world where Trump can really kind of make reparations and be forgiven for all that he has done or might have done. It's there, but it would have to be very lengthy and a lot of things building upon itself because it's proportionate. It's inversely proportionate to the level of psychological conditions that he might have, or some villain. I mean, even think of someone like Hitler, who classically is the great villain of our modern era, who has done things so horrifically evil that it's like it's impossible to humanize him. And yet we know he was a man who had artistic passions and ambitions, but we also know he was a man who had, whether it was the evil that drove him there or some sort of predisposed psychological condition, there was madness in his brain. So it's like the level for him, if he hadn't died, however he died, for him to come back from that, it would realistically be quite unlikely given the environment he was in and the amount of time he had left. But that doesn't mean that,
I mean, and that is to the, that's to the point,
repair.
To the point of like, and I think maybe some people might make this case about Trump, given, the sort of, if you could quantify the damage, but with Hitler, it's much easier, case to make, is that there is literally nothing that could be done to amend that, right? Too many lives were destroyed, both literally destroyed and ended, and also destroyed through loss of family and torture and trauma, that there is no price that could be paid, right? Like, because there is no amount of work or money or anything that could make up for that. And I think there are people, I have the privileged status that Trump did not do anything to my personal self, that would make it irredeemable. But so then I have to look to people who maybe they did, and then I have to make that, like I have to include that in sort of my my psychological like mathematics of is he redeemable? Because I think there are certain people who that he damaged their lives enough that they could say no, he's not. And I think that they could say that more honestly without a bias. I mean, I guess obviously it still is a bias because it's personal, but if we make it like, if we lower the stakes a bit, from Hitler, obviously, and Trump secondarily, and I think even maybe lower stakes than Michael Vick. What about Kevin Hart? I feel like Kevin Hart, that I don't know when the term cancel culture was first coined. I don't know how far back that goes, but Kevin Hart was supposed to host the Oscars, and somebody dug up an old 10-year-old tweet where he said something homophobic about, like, if I don't remember exactly, but something about if his child was gay, that he would have some sort of negative reaction.
Right.
And 10 years old, I think that was 2019, so that would have put it in like 2009-ish. Homophobia was a much more common, acceptable sort of punchline in that time. And like every 10 years you go back, it's more and more acceptable. And, my question is, like, was that a good choice to sort of cancel him for that? And I don't think it was, because I think he has, everything I know about Kevin Hart is he's a really great guy, and he made an off-color joke. And honestly, if I was held accountable for all of the off-color things I said when I was in high school and college, that I've grown out of, and I've, to many people, honest, like I've literally apologized to them for the way I acted. I would be canceled, and I'm not a public figure, so there's not a public record of it.
Well, I agree. And I think, encouragingly, Kevin Hart has largely been welcomed back into the fold, and because the overwhelming evidence is that he said something inappropriate, ignorant, homophobic, but has largely, progressed beyond that, has denounced it.
Yeah, on balance.
And that is, and I wasn't the first one to make this comment. Another comedian made this comment about Kevin Hart, basically like, that is the definition of progress, is the fact that you actually grow from something you might have said. We all want progress, but progress by its nature implies that we are growing from something which is, we all would say is cancelable. And so it was very much a double standard to sort of reject something he said that he apologized for and denounced, and to not give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, obviously there's, if he shows a pattern or if there's evidence of behavior, you can judge that. I do feel like comedians, in my heart, I give them an extra degree of concession or leeway, because I believe in the great art of stand-up comedy, the court jester, the satirist. It's really a crucial, important voice in our culture. Mm-hmm. And to say something important, you are going to have to, by the nature of their job, they have to workshop a lot of ideas, and a lot of them can be very inappropriate and downright awful. And if they reflect an interior life that is similar, then we can judge them for it. But we also need to understand, and Seth Rogen talks about this. He's like, look, comedy doesn't age well. It's just a fact. Like, comedians, you need to understand that when you say something that won't age well, but also culture. Like, take a break, take a breath, and don't judge a comedian by something that they might have said. Bo Burnham, who's an amazing, brilliant comedian, he talks about sort of the burden of someone who has grown up in social media. Like, he was a YouTube star when he was young. He's like, we all have said and done horrible, immature things as humans growing. He's like, the problem is my generation and culture, it's all on tape. It's all out there, and you're not really able to grow beyond it like everybody else who said things in private, or who've done things in private that were worse. So we definitely need to extend the benefit of the doubt for things like, and Kevin Hart's a good example. I think he's a good example of someone who shouldn't, become a villain because of this thing that he said. And, obviously the larger example of his life will bear out if that's true. there was a really moving article written by a Jewish reporter who has gotten to know Mel Gibson over the years before his infamous anti-Semitic, when he got pulled over and said those horrific things. And I believe Mel Gibson's story is much more nuanced than I don't consider him a villain. I don't consider him a victim by any means, but some people have just written him off. Oh, he's an anti-Semitic, hateful man. I don't believe that. And there was a really moving article about a Jewish reporter who became his friend over the years and wrote basically this article was like, guys, I have forgiven Mel Gibson. You should too. And it was talking about all the reparations he did do behind closed doors, quietly, doing, for other Jewish groups and basically, not just denouncing anti-Semitic language and culture, but actually doing work to try to, improve himself, but also others. But he didn't do it with headlines. He didn't do it, where on social media. So people didn't really know about it. And this Jewish writer was basically like, I want you to know what Mel Gibson has done to, basically try to pay for what he's done, in addition to apologizing. And, he's been very forthright about his own alcoholism. And he's like, yeah, when the drunk comes, it's the most hateful person. He's like, and I promise none of you hate him more than I do. And as someone who's got alcoholics in his family, I actually have a degree of sympathy for the monster that emerges from alcoholism. Mm-hmm. Doesn't excuse what he said and the damage he might have done to that Jewish police officer. And this sort of goes back to the nuance within life and in our culture, which maybe, to your point, nuance is what you get when you zoom out the furthest. And non-nuance or sort of binary is what you get when you zoom in the closest. In any given film, the writer and director should be very aware of how much they're zooming in to a story and understand that it changes. And, the Cruella prequel is to zoom out beyond the events of 101 Dalmatians, right? Mm-hmm. And you could even zoom in further to a scene and paint anyone the picture. I mean, it's important to ask yourself, like, have you been the villain in anybody else's story?
Remember when I lived in Tennessee and you came to visit, slept next to me. We shared a wooden bed, not meant for two.
Coming up, our conversation continues, if you can believe it.
Maybe we should have put some constraints on our topic?
Hey, it's a deep topic and you started it. Stay with us.
Talking, let's go to bed. 'Cause I just need to get out of my head. I've been trying to keep our burdens light. I just wasn't made for these times. But I'll stay as long as you will have me. And I'll follow if you wanna lead. And I'll share the load that gets so heavy.
There's the famous quote of, everyone believes that they're the hero in their own story. But there have been times in my life where I fear that I'm the villain in someone else's story. I'm like, and I don't mean that in just like, was I a dick just then? Because the answer to that is yes. I mean,
yeah, sure.
1,000 times, like I've been the dick in the situation. But the bigger question is like, am I being like systematically being the villain here? And like, it's a fear that I that I sometimes have, that am I in general, like, just wrong? And I think it's something that is worth considering. And maybe that's one of the reasons that I like these sort of, sometimes paradigm shifts, but.
And these are the themes that we were exploring with Minor Premise when we wrote it. And they're still there to a very large degree in the finished film. Eric, who became our third writer, was definitely drawn to these same themes as well. But even like earlier drafts, I remember I really wanted to lean into the alcoholism because I was really interested in this idea that the drink is something that can change a victim into a villain. it changes the brain. So this, this character's machine, it was like it messed his brain, and part of his brain was victim, part of his brain was hero, part of his brain was villain, but it all existed in there because we were all capable of all of those things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that's, I think, critical. It didn't change him. It allowed a part of himself. And that's the same way I feel about, when people say you shouldn't hold me accountable for raping this person because I was drunk. And I'm like,
Right.
no, because when you're drunk, all that is you're doing something that deep inside yourself you believe is okay. And I think that was the thing with Premise, is like, it was not that it changed who he was. It just gave the worst impulses, or not the worst. I mean, all these different impulses, some of them which were we could consider the worst. It gave them it put him in the driver's seat, right?
Yeah.
The way that maybe drinking does. And I think that is a kind of a critical point to what you just said, is that it didn't change him. It just allowed those things, those parts of who he was, to be at the forefront.
I might say, I could understand a rapist whose defense is, I was drunk, don't hold me accountable. I could understand them not necessarily thinking this was okay, but because of a lot of other deficiencies in their life, lack of self-control, perverted opinions about the opposite sex or their own sexuality, I could understand them inside knowing this was wrong, but not having the strength to actually fight against it or self-control, rather than the alcoholism unlocking this idea of, it's like, no, I actually believe they are mine for the taking. This is an okay thing. I believe it's probably a lot more nuanced than that, because
I just don't think that
do
makes
things that it's like, oh, I did that. I knew it was wrong. Something obviously a lot less, horrific
Egregious.
than egregious than rape.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So it's like the just because you have an understandable, and when I say understandable, I mean that in this very explicit, that I can understand it, not excusable, like, oh yeah, well that's understandable.
Yes.
But understandable in that I can compute it. That the motivations are understandable, that that you can say words to me that my brain computes. Okay, you have these perverted ideas, you have all this like sexual guilt, whatever it is, like that in no way formulates it like a reasonable, a reason to excuse the behavior. And so, I think that's the issue there, where it's like,
well, it's an interesting idea.
I have a hard time with like rape as a specific thing. It's like,
sure,
can that be redeemed? And it's like, well, I just don't know if like you can, and that's not fair. But it's like, but I think, anyway, maybe
it's a good
that's
question.
too deep as two men, maybe we shouldn't be weighing in on this.
These are good ideas to then extrapolate to stories, because we're talking about redemption, but there's a separate thing that we haven't really talked about, which is consequences. And when I believe someone may be in real life, may be able to be redeemed, I guess I'm talking about something on an emotional or heart or moral level, saying nothing about consequences, because there are consequences that someone can and should live with that may be with them for the rest of their life. For instance, jail time for something they did. So if someone and famously, so many men and women sort of find their moral resolution and redemption in jail. And doesn't mean they should be released necessarily. I mean, a lot of them have the opportunity, if they've exhibited this, to go on parole, but many of them are satisfied that they should live out their days in jail because they know their villainous choice, did something that they are now paying for the rest of their life. And why I believe in, that prison reform, certainly on a global level, is really important, but also sort of rehab within prison is very important, is because incarcerated men and women are still humans. They're still part of our culture. And even if someone's going to spend the rest of their life in jail, we should be enabling them to still sort of rectify their souls, if you will, if you want to sort of make grandiose moral statements. But within a film, within a story, it's interesting to sort of think about the idea of consequences for actions, because maybe it's zoomed in, classically a villain does something. The only sort of balance for what they might do is for them to die at the end. We've talked about Hans Gruber.
Hans Gruber was one of the ones I was going to bring up. And I was thinking the
great
question,
villain.
Would Hans Gruber, would it be ruined for you if we knew Hans Gruber's childhood or whatever.
Yes, it would be.
And-
partly because of the genre, the tone.
Right.
He's a great villain because you think he's a terrorist, but he's really just a thief, and he's smart, he's conniving, and you don't know anything about his backstory or his past trauma, and it's a well-written, well-realized within the sort of the zoomed-in scope of that story, and it's delicious when he falls to his death. You don't feel bad for him.
Well, because that's one of those cases I think I mentioned earlier where like we want there to be a clear villain. Now, John McClane is, I think it's one of the things that it does. He is not made a clear hero. I wouldn't say he's quite to the level of anti-hero,
But he's a flawed hero.
He's not squeaky clean Superman, right? He is somebody that it's more believable that that could be me, right? I could make those bad choices and fuck up my relationships, but I'm definitely not Hans Gruber.
Right.
And, but going back to the prison thing, I think that's one of the things that makes me question this idea. Because, so often, like, the way that we deal with our sort of cultural, sort of our entertainment, right? It influences how we then interact with the real world around us. It influences our ideas. And so to reject this idea of, like, that villains have, potentially redeemable backstories, to me, it's more problematic because of where we are in our culture right now, because there are so many people that are considered lowercase v villains that are in prison that like they shouldn't be, right? Like they are unfairly imprisoned for like maybe they broke the law, but but either maybe the law was unjust or it was applied too harshly. And but they are, because of that, they are immediately labeled lowercase v villains and they're written off. And it's like, but you don't understand, like their backstory does influence the petty crime that they did, right? Or like what about Jean Valjean? Is he a villain because he stole? And like, now let's take that and apply that to the person who like got a possession for marijuana charge and they're in prison for 20 years, like in a high security, like that doesn't make them a villain. I've had enough marijuana on me to equate to these kind of things, just before.
Absolutely.
And I just lucked out that I didn't get caught. Well, and I most certainly would not have been prosecuted nearly as harshly, but,
I think you're so right to kind of question this idea of, to the degree that our films are reflecting our own cultural struggles and our cultural opinions and views are influenced by the films. It's an endless discussion and it's a worthy one. I do think it's reflective of our culture, of where our kind of general culture's views are. I see this trope all the time in films where the villain is some type of serial killer. There's the backstory is inevitably that he saw action in war. He was a soldier and he went to war and he saw horrific things and he became a serial killer. Now, I think some of the backstory, that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. It's largely tropey because it's sort of this easy given that reflects this larger cultural idea that at least, for progressive people that are either downright anti-military, I'm anti-war, but I'm not anti-military, in an effort to explain a backstory of a villain, they sort of cast the villainy onto this larger, system of our United States military, which, when it's done poorly, really bothers me because I know many service members who have fought and who have seen action, who have been injured. I mean, not to mention my own family. And these are largely brave men and women who are serving their country, doing something I could never do. Now, certainly war is traumatic and war has traumatized people. And there's a reason that the suicide rate is so high among veterans because of what it does. And yes, there are people who their horrors of war has provoked them to evil, to killing. But to the point, it is interesting that is a common current trope with trying to explain villain, is using sort of the trope of like, well, they saw horrors in war. And it reflects, I think, what we as a nation are wrestling with, how we view our own military.
It's interesting, that you bring up the military, because there was actually a study published decades ago. And it was a sort of a longitudinal study that looked at the crime rates of veterans, as a percentage, of veterans compared to the general population. It was considered a very powerful study, and it showed that military personnel, per capita, they committed more violent crime than the general population. And that was, I think that paper was written in the 80s. And it was looking, the bulk of the people that it was looking at was, Korean and Vietnam War. I think that was the range. It was like 55 to 75, which I think encompasses those are like the two main conflicts that would have been seen. So I think that influenced a lot of opinions, that paper. Now, what's interesting is that paper has since been overturned because its methods were like deeply investigated, but it took like 25, 30 years. And what the people, when they went back and looked at it, they realized that if you sorted, or like the groups by people who were other than honorably discharged and people who were honorably discharged, the correlation disappeared. And so when you had people who say, they joined the armed forces, but they did not fit in the military culture. And again, I feel the same way as you. I do not like war. I think there are so many other solutions, but I do not blame our military personnel. I blame politicians because it is oftentimes easier and there's money to be made and all that stuff. But I would never blame, I have military in my family and friends. But the point I'm trying to make is that the people who join and then often are dishonorably discharged, when they reevaluated the data and modern data, they realized that that's where the bulk of that crime was coming from. But so I think that those tropes were based in sort of this incorrect publication. And I have to go back and look and see where it was, but I know these two papers exist. And there are many.
Meaning the type of people who were committing violent crimes later in life were already predisposed to creating them within the military.
Well,
so it wasn't
not
like
necessarily a violent crime, but they did something that sort of caused them to be discharged for other than honorably discharged. And if you look at that subgroup had an increased rate of violent crime later in life, whereas the honorably discharged had actually a lower rate of violent crime later in life. And it was sort of like a sorting mechanism when you bunch everybody together, which was kind of an unfair, cohort, because that is a difference. Somebody who serves for 20 years honorably is different than somebody who is discharged after 2 years because of, bad antisocial choices they've made. So, I've seen that trope. That was kind of an aside. That sort of popped something into my brain from
it's
years
interesting
ago.
because it forces us to sort of reckon with kind of this idea of villains and victims within our stories and within life. Because I think of the soldier in similar ways to the police officer. And the police officer has been a hot topic for sort of villainization and victimization in our culture. When you have sort of police brutality and one side is saying, well, don't let the bad apple spoil the bunch, and the other side saying, defund police. It's very interesting to think about when someone in authority, a public servant or a soldier does something wrong, actually commits a crime or does, a villainous act, trying to then unpack why they did what it did and how it relates to the larger group. For instance, the type of person who would volunteer for war or who might become a police officer, perhaps they're already someone who is, who is at worst eager for a fight, or at best sort of brave enough to not shy down from a fight, and so it would, the jobs naturally attract the types who might be on an edge, might be on sort of the razor's edge of falling into, one or two paths, which is why ultimately I am a big advocate of police reform, because there should be ways that, we can recruit better, or when we recruit, to actually educate and train these officers, and the ones who are sort of predisposed for a fight or hopefully who actually have, racist predisposition tendencies, to hopefully, if not weed those out, to sort of train against them. And I ran into this a lot. I've done a lot of video work for the veteran population, men and women who have served. I've done stuff with disabled American veterans. So these are men and women who have actually experienced traumas from war. And then, this one particular guy, he stepped on a landmine. He had 2 hooks for hands and he had one stump for a foot. So out of his 4 limbs, he had 1 left, and his face was very disfigured. And now he does a lot of counseling and work with other veterans who are experiencing post-trauma for injuries, because he's been through the worst. He basically almost died, and you walk down, you sort of look at him, and he's sort of like, but he's an older guy in San Antonio, great guy. And he told me, I asked him the question, why'd you want to join the war? And he was like, John Wayne movies. So film, the picture of the soldier in film, the hero, provoked this guy to join the army. And I've heard that from so many veterans. They wanted to join because of like the John Wayne era soldier. And what they saw, the disillusionment that came, was that this is horrific. I'm seeing people die. I'm engaging in things that are questionable. My limbs are being blown off. And I thought about that in the terms of a police officer, where I can imagine police officers, I want to join the force because of cop movies or cop shows. So the heroism that we're projecting on screens and our heroes. Now, this is a conversation about villains, but heroes can equally be as problematic. They're provoking men and women to join the force because of that. But the difference in police work and soldier work is the disillusionment in soldier work is like death, dismemberment, prisoner of war. In police work, it's boredom. It's my friend, our good friend John Tracy has been a police chaplain, and he's like, Thomas, 90% of police work is like pastoral. You're talking to people, you're in the community, you're diffusing situations. It's not drawing your gun, and it shouldn't be. And for the police officer who joined because of a cop movie and who wants a fight, the disillusionment of this job is like mostly like trying to be a peacemaker and being bored. For a lot of men and women, like that's like they want to fight against that, so they're looking for a fight. So when a black guy gets pulled over, they're like, all right, this is my time, to really get into this fight. And I bring that up because maybe the onus is on things as powerful as film to not be recruiting for these very sort of violent or aggressive types of, jobs that ultimately can create serious trauma or create villains out of potential heroes. If we're sort of projecting heroism to begin with. Now, I sort of just went on a rant there, and I'm not even sure how that might support or argue against earlier points I've made, but it seems a relevant thing to sort of bring up.
The other thing that I wanted to bring up was the looking at the conversation of good versus evil, villain versus hero, like where it's completely recast. Now, that's something that I love, and I feel like there's so much of that. There's so much interesting space where it's like you have these old stories where it's like, especially when it's allegorical and because of it, the good and the evil is so stark, that I really like to see that recasting of, I think like Wicked is an example of that complete recasting of the villain, or the new Maleficent or recent Maleficent film, I guess it's the only one called Maleficent, I think, but the recent film about Maleficent. And it kind of is derived from a quote that I think is often misattributed to Winston Churchill, that history is written by the victors, right? And I don't know who said it originally, but I think people often say it was Churchill. And the idea that like, because this person lost, they will be cast as the villain. They lost the fight. There are certain things where that is obviously not the case. Hitler was very clearly the villain in the story of World War II, in that, whole saga. But then there are other instances like Wicked where it's like, that's the question. What if she wasn't the villain? What if it was the other way around? Or I've been doing this thing where I try to write 2 pages every day, and I like try to do 2 new pages. And I was sitting with my daughter doing it last week, and I was like struggling to come up with a prompt. And she's really into wolves, and so she said, "Do you like write a story about wolves?" And so I was like, "Ooh!" And like immediately it came to me, and I wrote it very much in the like young adult fiction, but it was a fun little 2-3 page story. It was like, what if the big bad wolf was not the bad guy? What if Little Red Riding Hood was like the head of an army, and her grandma was the queen, and they were leading a force to exterminate wolves? And the whole story was actually about the resistance of the wolves, who were like, facing extermination at the hands of these like red cloaked warriors. And I just love that idea that like these age old stories are like, what if we got them wrong? And the story is being told this way only because in the end, Little Red won.
I like this sort of the recasting the villain, like I said, I like it too, but it's like at the end of the day, I like good movies. So some movies have done it well. I didn't particularly like Joker as a movie, not because I wasn't interested in sort of giving sort of the backstory of this great Gotham villain, but because I didn't just love the movie for other reasons. But to kind of to your point about history being written by the victors, history over time rewrites these things, and maybe depending on the cultural idea. And we're naive if we don't think the films that we make, the stories we tell, influence that. I mean, not just the articles we write, which I think demand a certain degree of nuance, but the films which don't demand that. We have freedom to tell the stories we want to tell. But there's consequences to that, and I guess how we choose to frame our heroes, our villains, and our victims is, all adds up to sort of influence on our culture and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just that there are stories sometimes where we want a villain and we want it to be clear cut, and there are other stories where there are antagonists. I mean, like, we all need antagonists, right? Mm-hmm. I antagonize my wife sometimes for fun, but like sometimes to help her grow. She antagonizes me. If I have a thought that is maybe not very well thought out, she will antagonize that. And, one of us will grow from that, right? My kids antagonize me all the time. I antagonize them, but like, hopefully none of us are villains to the other ones. We're sort of grinding and pushing each other. So being an antagonist is not necessarily a sign of villainy. Obviously villainy is a sign of being an antagonist, but a great thing to dig into. And even as we're, for those of us writing stories, making stories, good to be aware of the villains that we're writing and being aware of how much of a zoomed in story we're telling, how much of a complete zoomed out story we want to tell, and not having to do it one way or another, but just being aware of the implications. Yeah, I think that's the thing. Make sure you just understand, like, what are you going for, and then be true to that. What I will say is, and I wonder if you know this quote, since this is a quote from your number one boy, Alfred Hitchcock. He said, the more successful your villain is, the more successful your film will be. And I will rephrase that too. The more successful your villain is, the more successful your story will be. And not necessarily successful in like that they win, but like the more compelling. So sometimes you want them to be compelling because you understand them. Sometimes you want them to be Hans Gruber compelling because you so thoroughly reject them. So just, something to think about.
Man, that gets me thinking about all the great Hitchcock villains, from everything from Nature, The Birds, to Nurture, Psycho, to Self, Vertigo, to kind of a classic blue collar villain, Rear Window. I don't know. It's just great fodder. No, we've talked enough though. Up next, 2 picks.
Finally.
Put your hands up, let them down. Don't we all feel so much smarter having played a part in this? It's a nice hat, it's a crown. Out of all the hats I wear, it's
2 picks, 2 friends,
2 hours. I'm going to say, because we were talking about stand-up earlier and talking about comedy. And while I did watch the new Bo Burnham special.
I haven't watched the new one yet.
I'm not 100%.
Genius as his other 2?
There is a bit in there that is so incredibly like hilarious in its lampooning of Instagram, and that's all I'll say. That like it is genius. The whole thing is very dark, and so that was not going to be my 2 pick, but I will say that that one is maybe part of the pick. But for anybody who has not seen it, I would say his Netflix special, Get Get
Make
Happy?
Happy.
Make Happy. Make Happy is amazing. It does have a bit of a dark tinge to it as well, especially there in the end is sort of like, but I like that existential, crisis-inducing sort of spin on things. But the other one that I wanted to say, and I'm kind of now getting the territory of 3 picks just for me, is if you have not seen it, and this is a very controversial stand-up, it is also on Netflix, but it is incredible, is the special Nanette by Hannah Gadsby. It is one of the most honest, hilarious, difficult to listen to stand-ups that I've ever experienced. But it's like one of those times where I feel like that as a stand-up that legitimately improved me as a human, because it cuts so deep. It cuts so deep. So Nanette, it's on Netflix. The comedian's name is Hannah Gadsby. Those would be my picks. Make Happy,
Awesome.
Nanette, and the Instagram bit in Bo Burnham's new special.
I am a fan and student of stand-up, and I have not seen Bo's new special, but Make Happy was one of the most brilliant and genius pieces of writing and performance that I've ever seen.
Honestly.
And the fact that he was, he basically did it as a teenager. I mean, he is a true brilliant voice. Yay for stand-up. In the last week, I have gotten a healthy dose of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And, one wasn't quite the Blue Ridge. We hiked a local mountain here, Crowder's Mountain in the Charlotte area, went to the peak, and it was a great hike. It was about 2 miles each way. Did it with a couple families, the kids, they loved it. You go super high, and it was just a great way to spend Memorial Day. And then last week, I was in the Blue Ridge foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains for a little retreat, and went to this painter's house kind of near Asheville, in sort of southeast of Asheville, but that general area. And she bought this property in the mountains. The house was 250 years old. It has been renovated and expanded. She did some of it herself. I don't know if she fully bought it that way, but just a breathtaking cottage home that has been expanded. It's not huge, but it's still now a good sized single family home, capturing and inclusion of the wood and the history of this house that's over 200 years old, but also having it feel a little modern. And then her property, it just had the most breathtaking view of the Blue Ridge Mountains right there. And she said that was all woods. When they got the house 4 years ago, they cleared the land and just created this amazing view. She built her art studio on the property. So she's an abstract painter. And I was just so inspired by her home. And I was like, man, this is like life goals. This is like the property. This is like house. And she had a home office, that's just in this little study that was just one wall was just all windows looking at this view. And I was just like, man, and as someone in the Charlotte area, the mountains are just, right near us, and I've gotten my share of them. So, always good to get out in nature and see some mountains, but also be inspired. I was just really inspired by sort of the setting I was in. That's
awesome. You know what? That's such a good rec. I'm going to take you up on that. I'm going to go to the mountains next week.
But just go. Just get out there. See a horizon line. See a vista, a peak.
I mean, we are actually going to the mountains. We're leaving on Friday.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, we're going to do some kayaking. It's going to be a lot of fun. Love it up there.
Love it. Thanks for listening, everybody. Our featured music on this episode is from the album Transgressor by the band Quiet Company. Check them out on the interwebs and the mediums of socialness. And help us grow our audience by subscribing to this podcast wherever you listen to yours, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or elsewhere. Rate us, review us, tell your friends about us.
If you want to stay connected to us throughout the month, you can follow our Instagram account at TwoFriendsPod.
And get in touch with us at twofriendswithapodcast.com. We'll have the footnotes from this episode, links to the resources that we've discussed, and that's also got an email address, hey@twofriendswithapodcast.com, so you can email us.
Thomas, if people want to see your work, interact with you, touch you, hear you, feel you, where do they go? How do they do that?
I've actually changed it. It's now justinmoretto.com. JK, it's thomastory.com. Justin, if people want to see what our company, Bad Theology, is up to, where can they go?
I mean, they can go to justinmoretto.com. I own that domain, but I don't think they're going to see any of it there. Instead, they can go to badtheologypictures.com or follow us on Instagram at badtheology.
Yeah, don't go to justinmurder.com. That is a deep, dark spiral of darkness. We'll be dropping episodes every other week-ish, so keep up with us.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you for real, though.
You know what?
Thank you for real.
I don't even, sometimes I just feel like I'm hanging out and we're just talking to each other. The fact that, like, other people, would listen to this.
Thank you.
It fills my heart with joy. My sister-in-law, she texted me the other day about something. She said it was so funny, and it just made me smile. I think about the fact that
and how our view of story villains impacts our view of real-world villains.
and vice versa.
It's a fun conversation that goes deep and wide.
Really?
You're thinking of a joke? I don't know.
Deep and wide?
It does
All
feel
right,
like
never mind.
it feels like I'm teeing up something.
Yeah, with deep and wide?
It's
Yeah, you are.
That's a softball.
I just couldn't even go there.